In Daniel 12 verse 1, Daniel was told that in the end times, a time of distress would come upon Israel. This time of distress is the same thing Jesus was referring to when he said, "For then will be great tribulation." When laying out the timeline of how we envision the end times will unfold, questions about where the Great Tribulation fits into that timeline must be addressed. What exactly is the Great Tribulation? At what point of the 7 years does it begin? How long does the time of Great Tribulation last? At what point of the 7 years does it end? Jesus said the Great Tribulation will be cut short. What did he mean by that? And what specific event did Jesus reveal that will cut it short and cause the Great Tribulation to end? Welcome back. We are going to be covering a lot of ground today. I'm Brother John, and if you're new to the channel, what we're doing in this series is we're going through my book called Settling the Rapture Debate, chapter by chapter, and giving a summary of each chapter. And today we're discussing chapter 5, which is Introduction to the Great Tribulation. Now, as we get started, there are some very important aspects about the Great Tribulation that we really need to grab a hold of and understand. In particular, what is the Great Tribulation? Like, what exactly is this talking about? And number two, when does it begin? Where do we place the beginning or starting point of the Great Tribulation on our 7-year timeline? And number three, we're going to be discussing in the next video, which is when will the Great Tribulation end? And also number four, what causes it to end? So we'll be discussing that in the next video. But today, what is the Great Tribulation and when does it begin? Now, as we begin this study, we got to go to Matthew chapter 24, where Jesus began to discuss about the Great Tribulation in verse 21. And he says, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be." So when Jesus said this, it was part of a conversation that started earlier up in verse 15. I want to read this in a streamlined fashion. We're going to read verse 15, then verse 16, and then verse 21. It says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, for then there will be great tribulation." The abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke of or prophesied about actually triggers the Great Tribulation. So they're really one and the same thing. So as we look at this and we try to get a better understanding of what Jesus was talking about, we have to go back to Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, where we read the verse, the original verse, where Jesus was pointing back to. And it says here, "At that time, Michael, the great prince who watches over your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress, unlike any other from the nation's beginning up to that time." Okay, so it seems like the focus here is directly upon the nation of Israel. And so when we go over to Matthew 24, verse 21, and Jesus is talking about the time of great tribulation, and he says, "Such as has not been since the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be," that we should see it kind of in this limited sense as well, that the Great Tribulation is kind of focused upon the nation of Israel, because that's the context that we're given over in Daniel 12, verse 1. Now, I want to show you a couple of things here that are of interest, and that is when we see here that it says there will be a time of distress. Now, in the Hebrew, that word is zara, and it just means the same thing, like a time of trouble, a time of distress. But about 250 to 300 years before the time of Christ, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, and that is what we know today as the Septuagint version. Okay, so when it was translated from Hebrew into Greek, the word that is used is thlipsis, which thlipsis is a Greek word meaning trouble, tribulation, and oppression. Now, what's interesting is when we go to Matthew chapter 24 and we see the word tribulation. It's the same Greek word, thlipsis. So this gives us confidence that what Daniel was talking about in chapter 12, verse 1, is the same thing that Jesus was talking about. So the time of distress and the Great Tribulation, they're talking about the exact same time and the exact same events. Now, in order to understand this time of distress or Great Tribulation in the right light, we have to back up to Daniel chapter 11, and we need to read what it says about the activity of the Antichrist just before or leading up to this time of distress, so we can find out what the Antichrist is up to, okay, and what causes this time of distress. So backing up to Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 through 34 are really dealing with Antiochus Epiphanes and the events that happened in his time. And then we reach verse 35, which says, "Even some of the wise will stumble, resulting in their refinement, purification, and cleansing until the time of the end." So when it starts this phrase, "until the time of the end," what's happening is we're transitioning from what happened in Antiochus Epiphanes' time and the Maccabean revolt and all that, what happened. We're transitioning to the time of the end. So everything moving forward from 36 on is talking about the time of the end, and it's talking about the antitype or the end time Antichrist. All right, so in verse 36, it begins by saying, "Then the king will do as he pleases." Now, this king is speaking of the end time Antichrist. "He will exalt and magnify himself above every deity, and he will utter presumptuous things against the God of gods." And we know Paul made a statement about this in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 as well. "He will succeed until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been decreed must occur." And then we skip forward to verse 40, and it says, "At the time of the end," again, another phrase, this is giving us indication that this is talking about at the end of the present evil age and the time of the end time Antichrist. It says, "The king of the south will attack him." Okay, the king of the south is a little bit later, we find out that it's probably talking about Egypt, the country of Egypt, will attack the Antichrist. And then it says the king of the north, which is the Antichrist, he's called the king of the north, he will retaliate and he will storm against the king of the south with chariots, horsemen, and a large armada of ships. He will invade lands, passing through them like an overflowing river. Okay, these words, like an overflowing river, are important. And now we got to take another detour to go back to Isaiah chapter 8 to look at a verse there that's talking about the same thing. Okay, so reading in Isaiah 8 verse 7, it says, "So look, the Lord is bringing up against them the turbulent and mighty water of the Euphrates River, the king of Assyria, and all his majestic power. It will reach flood stage and overflow its banks." So the Assyrian army is being described as a flood that is coming into the land. And then it says, "It will spill into Judah, flooding and engulfing. And as it reaches to the necks of his victims, he will spread his wings out over your entire land, O Emmanuel." So this right here is the invasion of the Assyrian army into Judah. But the important language here is that the Assyrian army is coming in like a flood. And this right here is a type of what the future Antichrist will do. So when we go back over to Daniel chapter 11, it says that the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and a large armada of ships. He will invade lands, passing through them like an overflowing river. The same type of idea here. But this is now talking about the Antichrist and what he will do. It says he will enter into the beautiful land, which is speaking of Israel, many will fall, but these will escape: Edom, Moab, and the Amorite leadership, which is current-day Jordan. He will extend his power over other lands. The land of Egypt will not escape. He will have control over the hidden stores of gold and silver, as well as all the treasures of Egypt. Libyans and Ethiopians will submit to him. So these three countries will be conquered initially by the Antichrist: Egypt, Libya, and Ethiopia. So I want to pause here for just a minute and talk about the king of the north, because the Bible refers to the Antichrist in several places, and we could look over in Joel chapter 2 as well. The king of the north is kind of a term that describes the future Antichrist. And so what part of the north or north of Israel is this referring to? In other words, a lot of people try to determine where is the Antichrist coming from in modern day terms. Now, one of the main reasons that I would say that the Antichrist will come from that region is because of Micah chapter 5. And in this chapter, we have the prophecy, of course, where we know that Jesus came from Bethlehem. It says, "But as for you, Bethlehem Ephratah, too little among the clans of Judah, from you, Bethlehem, one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel." So it's talking about Jesus, because he was the one born in Bethlehem, and he's calling him the ruler in Israel. His going forths are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Therefore, he, the ruler of Israel, will give them up. It's talking about the Jewish people. He will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Now, we'll get to this later on in some future videos, but this right here, the woman who is in labor and has borne a child, is talking about Revelation chapter 12, sun-clothed woman who's pregnant and gives birth to a male child. And we know that that happens at midpoint of the 7 years. And so what this is saying is that Jesus will give them up until the midpoint of the 7 years. That's an important side note. And so when we go down here to verse 5, it says, "This one," this ruler of Israel, "will be our peace when the Assyrian invades our land." And so this name, the Assyrian, many scholars and many interpreters associate this name with the end-time Antichrist, because we know that the Antichrist will invade the land of Israel in the last days. And so the reason that I put the location from where the Antichrist will come from is because of this right here. He's called the Assyrian. Also, we could go to Isaiah chapter 14. In the latter part of that chapter, again, the end-time Antichrist is called the Assyrian. Well, the heart of the Assyrian Empire is in kind of the eastern regions of modern-day Turkey, and also Syria and parts of Iraq and so on. So I would say it's safe to assume that there's a good possibility that the Antichrist will come from that region. So as we go back and look at Daniel chapter 11, and we see the activity of the end-time Antichrist, here's what it says. "At the time of the end, the king of the south," that's probably talking about Egypt, "will attack him. Then the king of the north," right, the end-time Antichrist, "will storm against the king of the south with chariots, with horsemen, and with large armada of ships. He will invade lands, passing through them like an overflowing river." And then it talks about those who will escape him, but it says in verse 42, "He will extend his power against other lands. The land of Egypt will not escape. He will have control over the hidden stores of gold and silver, as well as the treasures of Egypt. Libyans and Ethiopians will submit to him." But then it says something interesting. It says, "But reports will trouble him from the east and from the north, and he will set out in tremendous rage to destroy and wipe out many. And he will pitch his royal tents between the seas toward the beautiful holy mountain. Between the seas, it may be talking about the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean Sea, or between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. But this is talking about being in the Holy Land in Israel. He will pitch his royal tents there. And it says he will come to his end with no one to help him. So what we have to understand is all of this activity, this military activity and these movements, these are all what are setting the stage for the time of distress that comes in the very next verse. Now, in Daniel 12, verse 1, it says, at that time. Okay, so now knowing what we know about the activity of the Antichrist and his military movements, okay, this is all the lead up to this time of distress. And it says now at that time, Michael, the great prince who watches over your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress, unlike any other from the nation's beginning up till that time. And that is because the Antichrist is now moving after conquering at least 3 nations in the south. Now he has set his target upon Israel, and he's going to Israel to destroy the land and to destroy the people. And so this is where this idea of, Jesus picks up on this, and he says there will be a time of great tribulation. So what is the Great Tribulation? It's referring to this advance, this attack of the Antichrist and his armies that are coming to Israel to destroy Israel. And all of this happens at the time of the abomination of desolation, which, when we tie this all together and some of the things that we talked about in the previous videos, what we have is if the abomination of desolation begins 30 days before the exact middle, we know that the Great Tribulation, we can put that on our timeline as happening 30 days before the exact middle. So just to cover again why we place the abomination of desolation at 30 days before the exact middle of the 7 years, it's because of this verse here, Daniel 12, verse 11, which says, from the time that the daily sacrifice is removed and the abomination that causes desolation set in place, there shall be 1,290 days. It seems like there will be 1,290 days left until the end of the 7 years once the abomination of desolation begins. So if you go to the end of the 7 years and you back up 1,290 days, that's where the abomination of desolation begins, which is 30 days before the exact middle. So from a midweek rapture view perspective, the Great Tribulation is placed on the timeline at 30 days before the exact middle, at that same time when the abomination of desolation event is initiated, because they're one and the same thing. So from this perspective, we have to ask, knowing what the Great Tribulation is, that it is an advance of the Antichrist and his armies that are coming into the land of Israel to wipe Israel off the map and to destroy it forever. Okay, how long do we imagine that this situation is going to last? And we remember what Jesus said. At that time, when you see this happening, when you see the abomination of desolation, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Don't even go and get your jacket because this is serious, right? He says, get up. For then there will be a time of great tribulation, time of great distress and oppression. And then he says in that next verse, if this time of great tribulation wasn't cut short, nobody would survive. In other words, if this attack by the Antichrist isn't put to a stop, nobody would survive. So in the next video, we're going to be discussing exactly what it is that causes the Great Tribulation to end. And as Jesus said, what cuts it short. And what we're going to do is then at that time, place the ending of the Great Tribulation on our 7-year timeline.